The Arizona Territory was no place for a woman alone, but Clara Mitchell had long ago grown used to the weight of silence. Since her husband's death the year before, she had managed the ranch with no help save her own hands and the stubborn mule tethered in the shed. The summer sun had scorched the land dry, and though the evenings brought cool winds rolling down from the mesas, they carried with them a different kind of unease, the kind that kept a widow awake at night, listening for sounds that might not be there. On that particular evening, Clara had just finished sweeping the dust from her porch when she noticed something unusual across the brittle horizon. A figure staggered along the dirt track leading past her land, half folded upon himself like a man who had lost both his strength and his direction. At first, she thought he was one of the drifters who sometimes passed through, scavengers or deserters from the war who begged at doors before moving on. But as he drew closer, Clara felt her stomach tighten. The man's shirt was stained with blood, his face streaked with sweat and grime. Even from a distance, she could see the painted streaks still faint on his arms, the kind of markings her neighbors whispered about at church, saying they belonged to Apache warriors. Her first instinct was to close the door, bar it with the iron rod she kept nearby, and pretend she had seen nothing. The cavalry patrols had been making their rounds, warning settlers that raiding parties might be near. To harbor such a man was to invite suspicion, worse, retaliation. Yet as she lingered in the doorway, she saw the man falter and collapse. In the dust, his body twisting like a broken branch. Clara stood frozen, torn between fear and something deeper, a memory of her husband, Daniel, who had once said that a person's first duty was to mercy, even in a land that seldom showed any. If you turn away from suffering, he had told her, you lose more of yourself than you save. The echo of his voice pushed her forward. With cautious steps, Clara crossed the yard, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man was young, perhaps not more than 30, though hardship had carved lines into his face. Blood seeped through, his side where a bullet had torn into him, and his breathing was shallow. Clara hesitated only a moment before hooking her arms beneath him and dragging him toward the house. The effort nearly broke her back, but somehow she got him inside and laid him across the cot near the fireplace. She fetched water from the basin, her hands trembling as she dabbed at his wounds. Beneath the dirt and blood, his skin was warm with fever. She cut away the shredded cloth at his side, wincing at the gash that had been crudely bound with strips of leather. Whoever had shot him had meant for him not to rise again. All the while, she kept glancing toward the window, fearful that a patrol might appear at any moment. If the soldiers found an Apache under her roof, there would be no explaining it away. Still, she could not bring herself to stop. She boiled water, mixed herbs into a poultice as her mother had once taught her, and pressed it against the wound. The man stirred, muttering words she could not understand, his eyes fluttering open for only a moment before slipping shut again. For hours, Clara worked in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the rasp of his breathing. The room smelled of smoke and iron, the heavy scent of blood mixing with sage leaves. As night thickened, she finally sank into a chair, staring at the stranger she had allowed into her home. Fear still gripped her, but alongside it came something unexpected, a spark of defiance. The land had taken so much from her already, her husband, her peace, her safety. Perhaps it would take her reputation too if word ever spread of this act. But for now, she had chosen, and she would see it through. When the wind moaned through the eaves, carrying with it the sound of coyotes. In the distance, Clara whispered softly to herself, "You'll not die here. Not while I still draw breath." The man did not answer, but his chest rose and fell, and that was enough. The first gray light of dawn slipped through the thin curtains, washing Clara's cabin in pale silver. She had dozed in the chair by the cot, waking at every rustle of wind or ragged breath from the stranger. When she finally stirred fully, her back ached from sitting upright, but her eyes went first to him. He was alive. Barely, but alive. Clara knelt beside the cot to check the poultice she had bound over his wound. It had darkened with seeped blood, but when she touched his forehead, the fever had not worsened. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. As she replaced the herbs, the man stirred. His eyes, dark and sharp even through the haze of pain, opened enough to fix on her. He spoke in a low, rasping tone, the words strange to her ear, the syllables carrying the rhythm of a language she did not know. Clara froze, unsure whether he cursed her or thanked her. After a moment he fell silent again, his eyes closing, but the memory of his gaze lingered. She whispered to herself, "Mercy, Clara. Just mercy. That's all." Still, doubt crept in. What would happen if the soldiers discovered him here? She could hear the voice of her neighbor, Mrs. Whitfield, sharp as a hawk's beak. Harboring a savage, Clara? What would Daniel say of that? "They'll burn your house for less." But Daniel's voice rose in her memory again, softer, steadier. "If a man's bleeding, you don't ask his politics before you bind the wound." With a sigh, Clara rose and set about her morning chores. She drew water from the well, milked the goat, and gathered what eggs she could. Yet all the while, her thoughts returned to the figure lying in her cabin. Each creak of the floorboards seemed louder than usual, each distant sound outside sharper, as though the land itself conspired to expose her secret. By midday, Clara returned to the cot with a bowl of thin broth. When she tried to lift his head, he winced and muttered again in that language she did not know. She spoke softly, slowly, as if words themselves might heal. "Drink. It'll give you strength." To her surprise, he seemed to understand the gesture, if not the words. His lips parted and she spooned the broth carefully into his mouth. Some dribbled down his chin, but most he swallowed, his throat working painfully with each gulp. As she wiped his face with a cloth, she noticed details she had missed in the rush of the night before: the scar along his jaw, the calluses on his hands, the leather thong around his wrist bearing a small carved bead. Not the trinket of a raider, but something personal, crafted with care. Later, while she mended a tear in her skirt by the window, Clara saw dust rising in the distance. A patrol of cavalrymen rode along the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the sky. Her breath caught in her throat. She prayed they would not turn toward her homestead, prayed the stranger would not make a sound. The riders passed without pause, their shouts carried faintly by the wind. Clara slumped back into her chair, weak with relief. She glanced at the man on the cot. His eyes were open again, watching her. And though his face revealed little, there was something in his gaze that struck her. Not hostility, but recognition. A silent understanding. "You oughtn't be here," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "But I reckon God didn't put you in my path just so I could let you die." The words hung in the air, fragile but binding. She realized then that she had made her choice, not just to treat his wounds, but to shield him come what may. That night, as the firelight flickered over the walls, Clara sat near the cot with her Bible resting in her lap. She read aloud in a steady voice, though she knew he could not understand the words. Still, something in the rhythm seemed to soothe him. His breathing grew calmer, his body less tense. And in the dim glow, Clara felt a curious shift within herself. Fear still gnawed at her edges, but alongside it came something she had not felt since Daniel's death: a sense of purpose. For the first time in months, she was not merely enduring the silence of her homestead. She was fighting against it, fighting for life, even if it was not her own. By the third day, Clara began to feel the full weight of her decision. The stranger, Apache, though she still did not know his name, was slowly regaining strength. His color returned, and his eyes stayed open longer, watching her with quiet intensity. He had yet to speak a word she could understand, but there was a sharpness about him, a keen awareness that unsettled her. Every morning, Clara rose before the sun to complete her chores, her mind restless with worry. She hid every sign of him, washing bloody rags before neighbors might see them hanging, disguising the thin line of smoke from her chimney so soldiers on patrol wouldn't take notice. Each action felt like a gamble, a silent wager against discovery. The whispers of the settlement rang in her ears even though she had not seen another soul in days. A widow living alone was already the subject of speculation. Men at the trading post sometimes watched her too closely, while the women muttered behind their hands. If they learned she harbored an Apache in her cabin, her name would not just be stained, it would be ruined. One afternoon, Clara loaded a basket with eggs and cornmeal and walked to Mrs. Whitfield's homestead, as she did once a week. The older woman greeted her with a sharp smile. "You're pale, Clara," Mrs. Whitfield remarked, narrowing her eyes. "Working yourself too hard again? A woman alone can't carry the load of a whole ranch." Clara forced a polite smile. "I manage, Mrs." Whitfield leaned closer, lowering her voice. "There's talk, you know. Cavalry says a band of Apaches has been raiding nearby. They claim one of them's been wounded. You'd best be careful. If they come this way—" She let the sentence hang, her meaning clear. Clara's fingers tightened around the basket handle. "I'll be careful," she said softly, then excused herself before the conversation could go further. The walk home felt longer than usual. Her ears strained for the sound of hooves, her eyes darting to every ridge where riders might appear. By the time she returned to her cabin, her heart was thudding as though she had run miles. Inside, the man was sitting upright for the first time, though still pale. He looked at her as she entered, his gaze sharp but not hostile. Clara set down her basket and studied him in silence. She could not deny the truth any longer. Her life was no longer her own. By taking him in, she had tied her fate to his that night. As she sat by the fire mending clothes, the man stirred and pointed toward the cup of water on the table. Clara rose quickly, brought it to him, and helped him drink. Afterward, he spoke a single word, low and rough. "Kaya." She blinked. "Kaya?" He tapped his chest. Kaya. His name. The sound of it lingered in the room, strange but grounding. Clara nodded slowly. Kaya. For the first time, his mouth curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Later, lying awake in her bed, Clara stared at the rafters above. Her mind spun with questions. Who was he, beyond the name? Why had he been shot? Did his people know where he was? And what would the cavalry do if they discovered she had hidden him? The burden pressed heavily on her chest. Yet beneath the fear there was a flicker of something else. Something that startled her. She had spent so long in silence and loneliness that even danger, when shared, felt like company. Kaya's presence filled the cabin in a way that eased the ache of solitude, even as it sharpened her fears. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she could not fully name, for safety, for strength, and perhaps forgiveness. In the silence that followed, the burden of secrecy settled over her like a cloak, but Clara knew she would carry it, however heavy it became. By the end of the first week, Kaya no longer looked like a dying man. The wound at his side still troubled him, but the color had returned to his cheeks, and he was strong enough to rise from the cot and take a few steps across the cabin. Clara had not realized how much space he seemed to take up until then, how his presence filled the small room not just with his body, but with an energy that unsettled the air. At first, she worried he might leave, stumble into the hills, and undo all her work, but he did not. Instead, he stayed close, watching her with a careful, measured gaze. He said little, though more words slipped from his lips each day, soft syllables in his own tongue, and when he could, halting English. One morning, Clara stepped outside to fetch water, only to find Kaya already at the well. He moved slowly, still stiff from his injury, but he had drawn a full bucket and set it near the steps. She stopped short, surprised. "You'll split your stitches," she scolded, though her voice was softer than she intended. Kaya gave a faint shrug. "Strong enough." His accent bent the words, but they were clear. Clara watched him for a long moment, torn between irritation and reluctant admiration. She had expected him to remain helpless, but instead, he seemed determined to reclaim his strength. And though she told herself she ought to forbid it, a part of her was relieved not to shoulder every burden alone. As the days stretched on, Kaya began helping with small tasks around the homestead. He carried wood for the fire, though Clara noticed he stacked it with care rather than in the haphazard way she usually did. He swept dust from the floor with deliberate strokes, as though the act were ritual rather than chore. Even in his weakened state, there was a quiet dignity about him, a sense that every action mattered. One evening after supper, Clara found him outside by the goat pen. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in red and gold. Kaya stood still, head bowed, his lips moving in what sounded like a prayer. She hesitated, watching the strange, solemn rhythm of his words. When he noticed her, he paused, then touched his chest lightly and said, "Thank." She blinked. "Thank? Who?" He pointed skyward. Sky, earth, life. He searched for the word. All. Clara's throat tightened unexpectedly. For so long she had felt abandoned. By God, by fate, by the world itself. Yet here stood a man the soldiers called savage, giving thanks with a reverence she had not managed in months. That night as she lay in bed, Clara thought of Daniel. He had always believed the frontier was a place to be endured, not mastered, and he often said the land gave only what you treated it with. Looking at Kaya, Clara wondered if perhaps Daniel had been right, that there were ways of living on this land she had never understood. Still, unease gnawed at her. Each kindness Kaya offered only deepened the risk she carried. She could no longer think of him as a stranger, yet she knew that if anyone discovered him here, his fate would be sealed, and hers along with it. The next morning, while mending a fence, Clara glanced up to see Kaya watching the horizon. His eyes narrowed, scanning the ridges. She followed his gaze but saw nothing. "What is it?" she asked, uneasy. Kaya did not answer at first. Then quietly he said, "Soldiers." Her heart jolted. "You see them?" He shook his head. "Feel." He tapped his chest. "Soon." Clara's stomach twisted. He was no ordinary patient, no passing wanderer. He was tied to something larger, a conflict that stretched beyond her cabin walls, beyond her grief, beyond her control. Yet as Kaya turned back to her, his expression softened. He pointed toward the bucket of water, then toward the field where her corn struggled in the dry earth. "Teach," he said. "Water. Better." With a stick, he sketched lines in the dirt, showing how to guide water from the well in channels rather than pour it wastefully. Clara stared at the crude drawing, astonished by its simplicity and its sense. She looked up at him, at the faint smile tugging at his lips, and felt a warmth bloom in her chest she had not expected. Kaya was no longer merely a man she had saved. He was becoming something else, a presence that unsettled her, challenged her, and, though she hardly dared admit it, began to ease the loneliness that had weighed on her like a stone.
By the second week, Clara realized the cabin no longer felt like her own. Every corner bore evidence of Kaya's presence, his careful orderliness, his quiet footsteps, the low hum of his voice when he worked. The silence that had once suffocated her was now broken by small, almost imperceptible sounds: the scrape of a knife whittling wood, the soft splash of water poured from the bucket, the low murmur of Apache words she did not understand but found strangely comforting. At first, Clara told herself she tolerated his presence only out of necessity. He was still weak, still dependent on her shelter. But she could not deny that something in her had begun to change. Each day, as they worked side by side, the sharp edge of her fear dulled, replaced by a wary curiosity and something warmer she scarcely dared to name. One afternoon, she caught him studying the photograph of Daniel that sat on her mantel. Picture was old and faded, but her husband's eyes still shone clear in it, his smile open and steady. Kaya lifted the frame gently, turning it in his hands. "My man?" he asked, his English halting. "My husband," Clara corrected softly. The word still cut at her throat like glass. "He passed last year." Kaya held the frame a moment longer, then set it back with quiet respect. He pressed his hand to his chest and bowed his head in what seemed to be a gesture of sympathy. Number. Words passed between them, yet Clara felt an understanding settle between them like a bridge spanning an unseen gulf dot in the evenings. They sometimes sat outside the cabin, watching the sun sink into the jagged ridges. Kaya would point to plants along the path, naming them in his tongue and then trying to explain their uses. Clara struggled to follow, but his patience surprised her. He showed her how to strip fibers from yucca leaves to braid cord, how to find moisture in cactus when the well ran low. You learn, he said, smiling faintly when she clumsily braided a strand. She laughed a sound that startled her, for it had been so long since she'd heard it from her own lips. Don't expect miracles, she teased, though her cheeks warmed but for all the ease that began to grow between them, attention remained silent and unspoken. Clara felt it when his gaze lingered on her longer than politeness demanded, or when her hand brushed his by accident as they worked. At night, lying awake in her bed, she thought of the quiet companionship they had built, and of the forbidden line that hovered between them. She knew what her neighbors would say if they saw her like this, sitting side by side with an Apache, sharing food, sharing laughter. They would call her a traitor, a woman gone soft, a fool. Yet here in the solitude of her homestead, the opinions of others seemed like whispers carried away by the wind. What mattered was the life within her cabin, the life that had somehow, against all odds, returned. One night, as a storm rolled across the hills, the thunder shaking the walls, Clara found herself confessing aloud. "Sometimes I think I died." "With him," she said, her voice low, her eyes fixed on the fire, "that I've been walking since as nothing more than a ghost." Kaya, seated across from her, tilted his head. "No ghost," he said firmly. He tapped his hand against his chest, then pointed at her. "Strong, heart, still here." Clara swallowed hard, the heat of the fire rising to her face. She looked away, but the words lingered inside her long after the storm passed. The bond between them was no longer something she could deny. It was fragile, unsteady, but it had taken root like a seed finding soil in the desert's cracks. And, though she knew it might bring danger, perhaps even ruin, Clara found herself unwilling to turn away. For the first time since Daniel's death, she was not alone. And in that fragile companionship, she felt the stirrings of life returning not just to Kaya, but to herself. The fragile peace of Clara's homestead lasted only a few weeks before the outside world came knocking hard and loud. It was a dry, windless afternoon when she heard the clatter of hooves in the distance. Clara had just finished splitting kindling when her mule brayed nervously, ears twitching. She looked up to see a small column of soldiers cresting the ridge, dust pluming behind them. Her heart lurched. The cavalry. She hurried inside, finding Kaya crouched near the hearth, mending a leather strap. Their eyes met, and in that instant, no words were needed. He understood. "Go," she whispered, pointing to the small trapdoor in the floor that opened to the shallow root cellar. Kaya hesitated, his jaw tight as though it stung him to hide. But at last he lowered himself into the dark space, his wounded side slowing him. Clara dropped the trapdoor shut and spread a rug over it just as a heavy fist rapped on her door. "Mrs. Mitchell," a voice barked. "Open up." Clara wiped her palms on her skirt, steadied her breath, and swung the door wide. 3 soldiers stood on her porch, dust-caked and stern. Their officer, a broad man with a bristling mustache, removed his hat briefly in greeting. "Afternoon, ma'am." "Captain Reynolds, U.S. Cavalry. Apologies for the intrusion, but we're on pursuit. A band of Apaches raided near the San Pedro. One of them was shot and wounded. We believe he may have passed through this way." Clara's throat went dry. She forced her face into polite composure. "I've seen no one, Captain." Just me and the mule, same as always. The captain's gaze swept the cabin interior. His eyes lingered on the cot by the fire, the herbs drying on the mantel, the faint trace of smoke. Clara held her breath. "Mind if we take a look around?" he asked, though his tone made clear it was no request. Clara's heart pounded so loud. She feared it would betray her. But she stepped aside, keeping her hand steady. "Of course, Captain. You'll find nothing." The soldiers entered, boots thudding against the floorboards. They glanced through her cupboards, tapped at the walls, even opened the door to her small pantry. One bent to peer beneath her bed. Another muttered about the smell of poultices. Reynolds studied her closely. "Strange thing, Mrs. Mitchell. We've word this Apache was badly wounded. Man couldn't have gone far. You're a decent woman, widow, aren't you? Wouldn't want trouble visiting your doorstep. You're sure you haven't seen anything?" Clara steadied her voice. "I've seen nothing but my chores, Captain. If someone's bleeding in the desert, I expect the buzzards will find him before." "I do." For a long moment, the captain simply watched her as though weighing the truth in her eyes. Then, at last, he tipped his hat. "Very well. If you do see anything, you'll report it. Harboring one of them isn't mercy, it's treason. Remember that." The men filed out, mounting their horses. Clara stood in the doorway, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. Only when the sound of hooves faded entirely did she shut the door and lean against it, trembling. She dropped to her knees, pulled back the rug, and lifted the trapdoor. Kaya emerged slowly, his eyes sharp, his body coiled with tension. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Clara said, her voice hoarse, "They'll come back. They think you're still alive. They'll search again." Kaya met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw both gratitude and guilt. He touched his chest, then pointed to her. "Danger." "Yes," she whispered, "danger me." She sank. Back against the wall, the truth heavy on her shoulders. By saving him, she had crossed a line she could never uncross. The cavalry's ultimatum still rang in her ears. Harboring one of them isn't mercy, it's treason. And yet, as Kaya reached out, resting his hand lightly on hers, Clara knew she would make the same choice again. Whatever came next, they were bound together now in secrecy, in peril, and in something deeper she could no longer deny. The nights grew restless after the soldiers' visit. Clara slept lightly, waking at every sound, the rustle of wind, the call of coyotes, the creak of her own cabin walls. Each time she glanced toward the cot where Kaya lay, she found him awake. As well, his dark eyes watchful in the firelight. He seemed always alert, as if listening for something. She could not hear. It was on the 5th night after the cavalry search that the world shifted. Clara had just banked the fire when Kaya straightened suddenly, head cocked toward the window. His body stiffened. "What is it?" she whispered. He raised a hand for silence. Outside, the night was still. Then Clara heard it too, the faint rhythm of hooves, softer than the soldiers, and the quiet thrum of voices carried on the wind. Her stomach dropped. She rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. Shapes moved beyond the fence line, too many to count, shadows against the starlit earth. A torch flared briefly, then died. "Kaya?" Clara's voice cracked. "People," he murmured. His voice carried both relief and dread. "My people." Before she could speak, the door pushed open. Figures slipped inside, swift and silent, their eyes sharp, their faces painted. Clara stumbled back, her heart slamming against her ribs. She counted at least 4 men, with more outside. They surrounded Kaya, speaking in a flurry of Apache words. Clara pressed against the wall, her breath shallow. These were the raiders. The soldiers had warned about. She expected hostility, even violence. Yet the men's voices held none of the jeering cruelty she had imagined. They spoke urgently, glancing from Kaya to his wound, to the room, to her. One of them, a tall man with a hawk feather braided in his hair, stepped toward Clara. His gaze was steady, unreadable. He spoke, and though she could not understand, his tone was not threatening. Kaya, still seated, looked between them. Then, in halting English, he translated, "They see. You help me. You save." He paused, searching for the word. "Honor." Clara blinked, not comprehending. "Honor?" Kaya nodded. He touched his chest, then gestured to her. "Because you heal, you come, must." The meaning settled in her like a stone dropped in water. They wanted her to go with them. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This is my home. I can't." But even as the words left her lips, she knew resistance would mean little. These men had crossed miles of desert to find one of their own. They would not leave without him, and, it seemed, without her. The women entered next too. Of them, draped in woven shawls, their eyes softer but no less intense. One approached Clara and touched her arm lightly, murmuring something in her own tongue. The gesture was not cruel but insistent. Kaya rose unsteadily to his feet, his wound slowing him. He looked at Clara, his eyes heavy with apology. "They take," he said simply. "You safe with them? Safe?" Clara's mind reeled. To leave with them was to vanish from the world she knew, to be branded a traitor forever by the settlers, the soldiers, the church. Yet to resist might mean her death or theirs. When the hawk-feathered man motioned to the door, Clara's knees weakened. She wanted to cry out, to demand her life back, her solitude, her fragile peace. But as Kaya moved toward her, steadying her with a hand at her elbow, she realized that choice had already slipped from her grasp. The night swallowed them as they left the cabin. The riders moved like shadows, guiding her onto a spare horse. Clara clutched the reins, her heart pounding as the homestead, her home. Her last tie to Daniel faded into the darkness. The desert stretched ahead, vast and unknown. Around her, the Apache rode in silence, their presence both terrifying and strangely protective. And beside her, Kaya rode upright, his eyes fixed forward, his body bearing both pain and pride. Clara's world had been taken yet as the torches flickered, and the horses carried her deeper into the night. She felt an unexpected flicker within herself. Not only fear, but something else. The beginning of a path she had never imagined, a path from which there would be no return. The desert night stretched endlessly, the stars flickering like distant lanterns as Clara rode alongside Kaya. Her muscles ached from the unfamiliar motion of the horse, her hands blistered from clutching the reins. Yet despite her fear, she could not bring herself to look away from the figures moving around her, silent, precise, each a living shadow against the moonlit sand. By dawn, the Apache camp appeared like an oasis in the barren expanse, tents clustered in a rough circle around a fire that burned with orange determination. Clara's heart thumped violently. She had imagined what awaited her inside, hostility, perhaps punishment, or the icy contempt of strangers whose culture she could barely comprehend. Kaya dismounted first, his movements slow, careful. Clara followed, clutching the reins with trembling hands. As she stepped into the circle, women emerged from the tents, their eyes sharp yet curious, studying her with a mix of caution and recognition. The men, meanwhile, remained mostly silent, though their attention never wavered from her. One woman approached, her posture straight, her face painted with subtle patterns of white and red. She extended a hand toward Clara, a gesture that was both an offer and an assessment. Clara hesitated, then placed her hand in the stranger's. The touch was firm, grounding. "You healed him," the woman said in English, her accent broken, but precise. "You saved Kaya. That is honor. That is why you are here." Clara's throat tightened. She had expected judgment, perhaps even suspicion, but not this acknowledgment. The words reverberated in her chest, validating the choices she had feared might condemn her. Kaya guided her toward a tent, smaller and simpler than the others. Inside, he gestured for her to sit. The woman who had greeted her remained nearby, speaking in soft tones to Clara, teaching her the basics of what she would need: how to carry water without spilling, how to move quietly, how to tend fire, and food so as to help rather than hinder. Clara listened, absorbing each instruction like a parched plant drinking rain. The Apache women moved around her with a strange combination of precision and patience, correcting her hands when she fumbled, and nodding approvingly when she succeeded. The routines were foreign, yet she felt an unexpected warmth in learning them. Each small act of participation connected her more deeply to the people around her. At first, Clara was terrified of making mistakes, of offending these strangers whose ways she could barely grasp. But gradually, the rhythm of the camp began to seep into her consciousness: the chant of water over stone, the muted laughter of children, the low hum of conversation carried from tent to tent. She began to feel a place for herself within it, even if she was still acutely aware of her status as an outsider. Kaya remained near her constantly, sometimes translating, sometimes simply offering a steady presence. His gratitude never needed words. Even when she struggled to keep pace with the tasks, his patience never wavered, his eyes never left her. That night, as the camp settled into silence under a sky full of stars, Clara sat outside her assigned tent. The firelight painted Kaya's face with soft amber, and the shadows of the camp danced across the sand. For the first time since she had taken him in at her cabin, Clara felt a curious combination of fear and belonging: a fear that the soldiers might return, or that she might never return to the life she had known, but a belonging that warmed her like a cloak against the chill of the desert night. She realized she was beginning to understand what Kaya had meant when he spoke of honor. Her act of mercy, what she had thought of as simple duty, had carried her into an entirely new world, one where trust and courage were measured differently than she had known. She had been taken into the Apache camp not as a prisoner, but as someone recognized for the depth of her care and the strength of her heart. As the fire crackled, Clara allowed herself to exhale fully, letting the tension of months fade just slightly. She did not know what the coming days would bring, or whether the cavalry would return to threaten her newfound sanctuary. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she sensed that she was not alone. She had found not just shelter, but a beginning, a place where life could start again in ways she had never imagined. The desert sun rose in harsh streaks of orange and gold, casting long shadows across the Apache camp. Clara woke to the scent of smoke and wet earth morning after a rare desert rain, and found herself both amazed and unsettled by the life around her. She had learned the rhythm of the camp: where to fetch water, how to tend fires without smoke drawing unwanted attention, even which herbs to mix for minor ailments. Still, despite the growing sense of belonging, a gnawing tension tugged at her heart. By mid-morning, word arrived that soldiers had been spotted not far from the camp. The men gathered quickly, voices low but urgent. Clara watched from the edge of the circle as Kaya and the others discussed what to do, their words fast and precise in Apache. She caught only a few phrases repeated in English: safe, hide, danger. Her chest tightened. She understood the stakes immediately. The cavalry could arrive at any moment, and she would be forced to choose: betray the tribe she was beginning to call family, or risk the wrath of the army by staying silent. Kaya approached her, his face calm but his eyes fierce. He touched her arm lightly. They come. You must stay. Help. Only if safe, Clara nodded, but her stomach churned. The soldiers were not like the distant, faceless threat she had imagined when hiding him in her cabin. They were close, disciplined, armed, and relentless. One wrong move, one whispered word in the wrong tone, and Kaya or she could die. As the cavalry approached the camp's perimeter, the Apache moved with uncanny precision. Children were hidden first, then elders, then the women and hunters. Clara's hand shook as Kaya handed her a small knife, pointing toward the underbrush where she could take position if needed. She realized this was not just a test of bravery, it was a test of loyalty, a test of whether she could stand with them against the world she had once called home. When the soldiers appeared, moving with practiced formation, Clara stayed behind. A clump of mesquite, heart-hammering. The sounds of boots, shouts, and the sharp crack of rifles carried across the sand. She saw Kaya signal with subtle movements, and the tribe responded, vanishing like shadows into the landscape. The soldiers were searching for a single wounded man, but the Apache were everywhere, yet nowhere a masterful exercise in misdirection and survival. Clara realized she had a role to play. When a small detachment veered too close to where she crouched, she whispered warnings to Kaya, guiding the tribe's movements. Her heart raced, but her fear sharpened her focus. Every word she translated, every hand signal she relayed, became an act of courage, a silent promise she was keeping. Hours passed, though it felt like days. At one point, a soldier came startlingly near, his eyes sweeping the brush. Clara froze, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. But the soldier moved on, unaware of the small figure hiding in plain sight. She exhaled slowly, the relief nearly overwhelming. When the sun began to dip low, the camp regrouped. No lives had been lost, no capture made. The tribe celebrated quietly, not with loud triumph, but with the calm pride of those who had survived and protected their own. Clara found herself pulled into the circle, the women touching her hands, the children peering at her with curiosity rather than fear. Kaya's eyes met hers, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "You did well," he said softly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Heart strong. You, one of us now." Clara felt her chest swell not with triumph, but with a complex mixture of awe, relief, and the quiet understanding that she had crossed a boundary she could never return from. She had risked her life, her old world, everything she had known, and in doing so, had chosen a new allegiance. For the first time since taking Kaya in at her cabin, Clara understood the full cost of her compassion, but also its power. She had become part of something larger than herself, something that demanded courage, loyalty, and trust. The cavalry might come again, the outside world might continue to intrude, but she had passed the test. She belonged here, in this desert, with these people. As night fell and the fire burned low, Clara looked around the circle of faces and realized that the bond she had formed with Kaya and his tribe was no longer fragile. It was forged in risk, in mercy, in shared fear, and in survival. She had chosen, and she had not faltered. The first light of dawn painted the desert in shades of gold and rose, casting long shadows across the Apache camp. Clara woke with a sense of anticipation, tempered by a quiet exhaustion. The night had been filled with whispered counsel, planning, and careful observation. Though the soldiers had retreated for now, their presence still loomed like a specter, a reminder of the danger that awaited beyond the mesas. Clara rose and stepped outside her tent. Kaya was already there, standing near the fire, watching the horizon with an alertness born of years in the wild. When he saw her, he offered a faint nod, a gesture that carried more warmth than words could convey. "You ready?" he asked, his English halting but clear. Clara swallowed. "I think I am," she said. She had faced fear before, but this day would require more than courage. It would demand everything she had learned, everything she had become since entering this new world. The camp stirred, moving with quiet purpose. Warriors and hunters checked weapons and mounts, women prepared provisions, and children followed the rhythm of life that had begun to feel familiar to her. Clara moved among them, her hands steady, her mind focused. She understood her place. Now not merely as an observer, but as a participant, a member of this living, breathing community. As the sun rose higher, a scout returned from the ridge. Soldiers had been sighted again, moving closer to the area. The camp erupted into controlled activity, each movement deliberate, almost ritualized. Clara felt her pulse quicken but kept pace, carrying water, tending the fires, and relaying signals under Kaya's guidance. She had become a bridge between the wilderness and the human, between caution and action. When the cavalry arrived, they found no easy target. The Apache moved like wind and shadow, their tactics honed, their coordination flawless. Clara observed. From a ridge with Kaya, transmitting small warnings, positioning supplies, and supporting the tribe in whatever ways she could. Every command she passed, every hand she lent, reinforced her place among them. Hours later, as the soldiers withdrew, defeated by what they could not understand or capture, a cheer rose from the camp, but it was quiet, not triumphant. It was the sound of survival, of honor preserved, of a family protected. Clara's chest tightened as she realized the depth of what she had joined. Kaya approached, his face illuminated by the golden glow of the sun. "You, strong," he said simply. "Heart, true." Clara's lips curved in a small smile. She had feared judgment, feared exile, feared losing the last remnants of herself. But here, with these people, she found acceptance. Her grief for Daniel remained, a quiet ache in her heart, but it no longer defined her. She had been reborn into a life she had never imagined possible. The women of the camp gathered around her, teaching her songs, movements, and the careful ways of daily survival. The children watched her closely, learning from the way she carried herself, the way she moved with purpose and compassion. She realized that the Apache had not only accepted her, they were shaping her into one of their own. As evening fell, Clara and Kaya sat by the fire, the last embers flickering in the desert. Wind. For a long moment, neither spoke, content to share the silence. Finally, Clara broke it. "I never imagined any of this," she said, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Kaya's hand found hers, warm and steady. "Life, strange," he said, "but ours now." She nodded, feeling the truth of it deep in her bones. She was no longer the lonely widow who had hidden a wounded man out of mercy. She was part of something larger, bound by courage, trust, and the quiet strength of shared survival. She belonged here, with Kaya and his people, in the desert that had once seemed harsh and empty, but now brimmed with life, meaning, and connection. The wind whispered across the mesas, carrying the scent of sage, smoke, and the promise of tomorrow. Clara closed her eyes, letting herself absorb the warmth, the belonging, and the certainty that she had found a home unlike any she had known. The past remained a shadow, but it no longer weighed her down. She was here, alive, and finally, truly, a part of something greater than herself. As the stars emerged above, the camp settled into quiet. Clara sat beside Kaya, hand in hand, listening to the rhythm of life around her. She had taken him in to heal, and in return, the Apache had taken her into their world. She had lost a life she once knew, but had gained a belonging she could never have imagined, a life of honor, connection, and resilience in a land that demanded both. The desert was no longer lonely.